Hi, I'm Guela Solow from ARC Petrov, and my team and I are here today to talk about the Niagara Falls Entertainment Centre. I'm going to introduce the team in the order of the speaking. So my partner, Christophe Gauthier, will follow me. Director of Visualization, Sean Van Huyn, will speak after Christophe. Then will be our colleague from Theatre Collaborative Consultants, Ato Zaghi, following which will be our project director, Lee Strickland. So that's the team that's here today, and we're excited to share this project with you and also answer questions at the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. So this project is about the transformation of an idea. For us as architects, it's the transformation of a visualized idea, taking the falls and transforming them into an interpretation of that rhythm and that pattern and that dynamic experience in the facade of the building, in the graphic design of the signage, in the interior material palette. But for the larger world, it's a P3 project. So it's the transformation of, it's a big idea, which involved the collaboration of all levels of government, from the province, the region of Niagara, the city of Niagara Falls, the OLG, and a complex team of consultants, obviously design consultants. But it's a big idea about how that collaboration of this complex team coming together can make a significant difference in the complex of uses that are available in the public sector as a public amenity, as public uses. And of course, it's located in a place with a big identity, Niagara Falls. And that can't be ignored. Obviously, as architects, we were super inspired by the falls themselves. They're magnificent. You know, we all live so close to the falls, but we hardly go there as not being tourists here. But they are magnificent, and we were inspired by them. We also were aware that in Niagara Falls, it's a place of big ideas, and it's a place of very small ideas. You know, it's mom and pop businesses that come and go as economies grow and shrink. It has a very intense little tourist street that you've probably all seen and remembered. And it also has a big, magnificent vision, Queen Victoria Park, about parks in Ontario, and a well-protected, you know, edge between the falls and the city, and a bit of a bunch of dichotomies, as I'm sure you've all experienced when one goes to Niagara Falls, between all those big and small ideas and how they come together. So for us, we were faced with a site, a complex site, a really challenging site. So this is our site here. It's on the west side of the Hilton Towers, separated from the OLG casino, the Niagara Falls Casino, which is on the left of this screen, by the Hilton Towers. And it was part of a very competitive design process, a P3 procurement process, which included competitive teams of design professionals that involved the owner, developer, tenant, constructor, facilities operators, and regulatory compliance professionals, who all had to work closely together in a team environment for many months to put forward different schemes and proposals for their sites. And all 5 sites there was 5 teams, and all 5 sites were different. And ours was super challenging because not only was it not adjacent to the Fallsview Casino, this theater project was supposed to serve casino patrons and extend their visit and their experience in Niagara Falls, part of the tourist agenda of the city of Niagara Falls, to get people to stay there for a little bit longer. But also it was located adjacent to a big active hotel on top of a parking podium on a street that had a really aggressive slope down to the falls. So it had all these challenges of the site. It also had opportunities, next slide please, which is it sort of anchored, this is our intervention, our architectural, you know, urban design that anchored that corner. It anchors the strategic corner as one enters Niagara Falls, which is at the corner of Stanley and Murray. So most people that arrive to Niagara Falls drive south along Stanley and then turn left at some point to get towards the falls. And sorry, go back for a sec, please. And so our intervention was to create this kind of beacon which anchored that corner at Murray and Stanley, and sort of directed traffic, towards the falls and towards the casino, but also extended the casino sort of mandate or jurisdiction in Niagara Falls with a kind of welcoming hand to sort of define this larger casino precinct with a host of different amenities, including this 5,000 seat theater and public square at the corner. Sorry, next. So, of course, going to a theater of this magnitude, 5,000 seats, I think it's the largest theater in Ontario, is about experiencing spectacle, and it's also about being part of that spectacle. So there was this absolute urban design idea about the whole procession from the street fabric or from the casino or from the car drop-off or from the bus into the theater itself, and how that experience could make the patrons part of the spectacle of being going to the theater and being in Niagara Falls, a place of many spectacles. The falls, obviously, and the act that you're going to see, and the whole casino experience. So next, please. And again, addressing that really complex site, which had many levels and was on a really severely sloping street, to create a theater that was essentially a box in the air. Most theaters are at grade and have a seamless transition from street fabric into the facility itself. We had the added complexity of having to have patrons and artists come through the facility and go up into the theater, which was above grade, which is super challenging, especially with the province's mandate for accessibility. And we did that by starting to introduce a series of public spaces that would create the spectacle and event. And as people circulated through the theater to get to the seat or to the audience chamber, they would get glimpses of the falls or glimpses of the city, and they themselves would become on show through these sliced visions into the theater itself. Next, please. So as we mentioned, there was the team was incredibly complex, and in winning this bid, one of the first challenges we had was to address the regulatory bodies, and especially the planning department in Niagara Falls, and really make a case for how this site, which wasn't the optimal site, could speak to the urban design thinking and an urban design strategy, which was a larger vision. So of course, we studied very carefully how patrons could arrive at this very important corner, how a piece of architecture can transform a city and transform the agenda of a city by its placement and by its identity on this corner. And we also looked at it in a very granular way to explain how accessible it would be despite not being adjacent to the casino itself. Next, please. So that all began with a series of urban design studies. And the first one was really trying to understand how that intersection could be anchored by a piece of architecture and a piece of exterior public space, and to try to design that square or that corner at the corner of the intersection of those two streets and make it accessible, because nothing was flat and nothing was at grade. So go to the next one, please. Yeah, so we kind of looked at the arrival sequence into the theater from every different perspective. So the first was the pedestrian that I mentioned. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, arriving to the main square, and it's sort of in the front door. But the second one, which was super important, was buses. So a lot of people arrived to Niagara Falls in buses. You've probably seen them. And so buses had to get into the theater. And remember, our site was super tight. So we decided to raise the theater off the ground and have the buses go like on a piano nobile kind of idea. So the theater was on sort of the first or second floor, however you want to call it. And then the buses and all the workings of the theater would be at grade. So the buses actually pass under the theater, drop off and go back out onto Stanley. And there's two kinds of buses. There's the buses for the talent, which have to be, very secure and very, very private. And then there's the buses for the general public. So we somehow had to coordinate all those buses passing underneath the theater in the super tight site. And that obviously took a lot of gymnastics with traffic consultants. So next. The next thing was AODA. So, trying to get parking close to the facility that was accessible to people that had mobility challenges was another big challenge of this site. And we tried to locate parking on levels beneath the theater and bring them up into this ground floor in a way that they could enter the theater with everybody else. So there wasn't a hierarchy of like front door, back door, or accessible versus the other patrons. Next, please. So the square itself, we studied extensively to understand how people could go up that slope of Murray Street away from the falls into the main square and then up into the plaza in front of the theater itself, and tried to make it as open and accessible as possible. And also we imagined narratives of, outdoor concerts or like really informal concerts. If Bob Dylan was playing here, like maybe there would be some cool, little ability for a small group to gather in this square with stairs and make it kind of impromptu stage. So we tried to imagine really how could the square extend the presence of the theater into the city itself. Next, please. And the connection to the Hilton Hotel was to the Fallsview Casino was a huge challenge for us. It was mandated in the PSOS, in the requirements for the project, that wherever your theater was located, there had to be a direct connection to the Fallsview. After all, this was an OLG initiative, and they wanted casino patrons to be able to go see the shows. And we had a hotel between the theater and the casino, so couldn't do it. So we did this kind of weird elevated, like +15 sort of bridge that snaked around the hotel into the lobby itself. And then eventually through negotiations with the hotel, who was part of the development team, we developed a connection directly through the hotel. So there was kind of a promenade from the casino itself at +15 over Fallsview Boulevard, and then into the hotel proper through all the hotel amenities into the theater lobby. And that was a hugely complicated thing from a building code perspective, as you can imagine. And Lee's going to speak a little bit about those challenges in his part of our talk. So next, please. And so altogether, we looked at these many different ways of arriving and tried to have one central space. No matter where you came from as a patron, you would arrive into this lobby and there would be this scene happening there. And if you were the talent, obviously, you would arrive into the theater itself. So next. This is looking down at the theater from above, so you can see how we jammed a theater, a 5,000 seat theater, into a very small urban site, despite it being Niagara Falls. Next, please. So this is now looking at the ground floor in a little more detail. You can see how the talent buses come in from Stanley and they park on the left, and the patron buses park on the right and go into the lobby itself. The talent buses go through the sort of back of house area, and the back of house includes all the support spaces so the talent can arrive in a secure manner. And they've been designed to facilitate all the operational efficiencies of loading and storage and the number of people that are involved in the entourage of the talent. And are expecting top talent. So it would integrate the artists, production management staff, technical support, and all those critical adjacencies and synergies had to be in place in this very tiny space that was really organized vertically instead of horizontally, as it is in most theaters. So the dressing rooms, the crew lounges, lockers, green room, all of that are kind of stacked vertically beside the theater itself. Whereas on the other side, which is the south side, the plaza area where the patrons come in, again, all those amenities and that whole promenade experience of getting from your car, bus, or foot into the theater itself, that whole promenade was a vertical experience. So keep going. And that vertical experience allowed people to kind of snake up through these series of lobbies that were all stacked like a hill town or something. And every time you circulated through, you saw the egg or the theater itself, and then you saw a view back to the city. So you would get glimpses of both of these things. And we really thought about the urban design and the audience chamber kind of like a Noli plan, where the audience chamber interior space would form the fabric of the city. So just like in a Noli plan, where the exterior public spaces and the interior public spaces have this kind of continual narrative, we tried to think about the interior of the audience chamber forming part of the public realm for the city of Niagara Falls and the patrons. So keep going, please, Zach. So this is explaining how you would sort of snake through the building and get higher and higher from the lower orchestra to the upper orchestra to the first and second balconies. And there we are, we're climbing up to balcony 1 and then to balcony 2, which should be there. So you can see that this egg that's sitting on this tiny site creates an audience chamber that is wider than it is deep, which was super challenging from a design perspective, but created this like fantastic intimacy between the performer and the audience themselves. And Atus will speak a little bit more about that when he talks about the actual theater design. And also just wanted to point out like how skinny the spaces are around the theater. So there's this great sense of like, you know, intimacy and you know, that you're in a happening place. Everybody's kind of really tucked in around the theater, and the theater shape is very immediate. Back of house, again, stacked vertically on the west side of the design. Okay, next. And then right into the kind of bowels, which are in the air of the theater. So these are the catwalks. And again, Atus will explain this to you much better than I can. Okay, so then just zooming out like sort of 3D a little bit. So again, just back to the beginning, again, Stanley and Murray, how our theater piece, a very small piece of architecture, really was meant to be transformative. Like what a big, fantastic idea about how architecture can transform a place. And in the language of the building that Christoph will speak to about momentarily, how the falls themselves really inspired the facade of the building. Next, please. And how this sequence of arrival and experience we studied through video and through stills, you know, how people would enter the building through this dark base into this white floating box above. Next. And how it would be accessible, obviously, for all ages and all walks of life. And this carries you into the theater, into the lobby space. So you're now under the theater, but outside the building. And keep going, Zach. And then you're in the lobby again, under the theater, always under the theater. Keep going. Into these sort of tickets, coat check, all that sort of thing, and then keep going. And then into the series of stacked lobbies, and Sean will explain to you the interior design palette and how we tried to keep going, Zach, and how we tried to bring that idea of the falls and its rhythm and its syncopated pattern into the interior as we did on the outside of the building. And as you're snaking around and you have this round theater against you, and there's that space where you can peek out into the city and you can make a spectacle of yourself and do the selfies. And that whole experience, grab a drink. There are minimal amenities, but there were amenities tucked in around the theater wherever we could. And then into the black box of the theater itself against the white of the outside. And then coming inside to this super dark space. It's almost like going behind the falls. That was our inspirational vision for this. Like when you're outside, it's all light and white and reflective. And when you're inside, it's dark and intimate. And next, please. And you have that sort of experience of being in a dark space, in an intimate space behind the falls themselves. And again, the last point just about this being for amplified sound, this place, and that there's this intimacy between the spectator and the spectacle, or dissolving that edge between spectator and spectacle. So over to Christophe Gauthier. Thanks.
So the second is the facade. Is a P3. And we were on the P source, we have to use ACM, this means the composite aluminum panel. And this project is pretty large. This means mostly the facade is 120 meter by 40 meter tall. And you imagine it's mostly a full soccer field as a facade. So, I mean, and how we dealing, because we have floor, we're not really equal, we have different floor, are we dealing to match this floor? And also we want to bring some verticality and try to design the facade with, Guela said, is inspiration of the fall. What we came to try to be really economical, we took, and you can see the sketch A3, we took a full-size panel, ACM. Usually ACM came, the sheet of ACM, the panel of ACM came in standard pieces, mostly the 1500 by 350, and it's 3 different lengths you can get from the factory. This means because this project was large, we could use large panel. And to be economical, what we have done 1/3 and 2/3. I mean, we took the panel vertically and we cut the panel in 1/3 and the panel in 2/3. And we did the same horizontally. So I mean, this gives us some granularity for us to create a pattern. I like to work with one pattern I work really, really a lot, and it's called a look and say pattern. You can look on the internet, you will see is a pattern usually who don't exceed the number 3. So I mean, it's really easy to deal with 3 things: 3 color, 3 panel, 3 material. Is something really, really easy. This means this pattern, I would say, helps sometimes to put stuff on the paper and to organize. I mean, this is what I did here. I create 2 patterns, one horizontal, one vertical. One is number and one is letter. And this allowed us to create a pattern with full standard size panel, or mostly you don't throw away any products. And when you start to apply with the top of the elevation, it can give this granular. This means all the public circulation is against this facade. This means what we did with this stripe, go to the next slide, we did stripe of lights. So for people to start to be engaged with the streets. So you see them, they disappear, you have lighting inside, and also we play with the panel, pushing up and down the panel to try to create this kind of idea of the fall. And this was mostly where the design, I would say, start. And after we have the podium with white, this means it was kind of monochromatic here, and the top was really strong because we have all this vertical curtain wall space through a pattern. Now, through the process, and it's a P3s, we were looking how we can do that better. We decide to don't cut the panel horizontally. We keep full size panel, but just cut them vertically. This means we have still 3 sizes. I would say if you have a 1500 panel, you have one panel is 1500, the second panel is 900, and the third panel is 600. And usually the pattern I use have the number 1 panel is 50%, and number 2 and 3 are 25 and 25. This means mostly you don't throw away nothing. And we start to develop this pattern on the facade, playing with different texture. We have a matte panel and we have a really glossy panel. And for cost reason, Also, we have created is what you have the red boxes. These are the curtain wall. Instead to have strip of curtain wall, we kind of condense the curtain wall together. But in the same time, we add, to don't kill the design, we add spandrel aluminum panel through the process. I mean, the facade seem seamless. And this was sketches to study about that. And we developed some rendering just to try to assess the idea. And we realized on the ground floor, the ground floor was really hard because you have all this structure who have to support the theater and the different floor. And it was really hard to have something really, really organized. And what we decided is to put the bottom black to make the box floating and be able to create this kind of big shadow line on the bottom where everything is white inside, to make this box floating and to deal with the different element for us and try to play with that. And this worked pretty well, and is mostly where we went. And I think so the next one will be during construction. This is, this is it. Like, I mean, you have the black panel in the bottom, the white panel on the top, and to have all these stripes. We have also integrated some light between the joints because OLG was really interesting about that. To, you know, when it's a day of the breast cancer, the building can turn with little strip of pink. It can illuminate a little bit the night. And this is on the Murray Street with the box, and this is during construction. Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Sean Van Huyn, and I'm the Director of Visualization at Art Petrov and was part of the design team on this project. The interiors of Niagara Falls Entertainment Centre drew inspiration from the exterior. There is a very clear and bold aesthetic of a predominantly white and black palette on the exterior. On the white massings, as Christophe has mentioned, we tipped our hats to the falls in our approach. We wouldn't dare compete with the majesty of the falls, but we turned to an abstraction of this wonder. We see strips of glossy white aluminum composite metal panels, as Christophe mentioned, alternating with strips of matte white panels with strips of vision glass. This created a shimmering effect that interacted with the sky throughout the day, reminiscent of the falls. This was our translation. The white and black aesthetic was carried into the interior as a light palette and a dark palette. A simple way of thinking about our approach was the vertical circulation volumes, and the interior of the audience chamber would receive the darker palette, while all other areas would receive the lighter palette. We wanted to keep the interiors primarily neutral to let the spectacle of patrons and performers and artists be the injection of color and take center stage, so to speak. The abstract interpretation of the falls can be seen in three main areas of the project. The first, as we've already discovered, is on the building's exterior facade. The second area is what we call the feature wall. And the third is the inside of the audience chamber. The feature wall in the main lobby begins on the entry or ground level and fills the east wall for 3 levels or the rough height of 16 meters. Like the vertical pattern on the exterior, the shimmering of the feature wall was achieved by alternating strips of subtle, different finishes. We played with 5 different metal panels, including different aluminum shades and textures and even mirror. To recapitulate, this created the shimmering verticality whose inspiration came from the falls. Also, by having a simple palette approach, it helped with deciding what to pick for what. Finishes would be governed by our general principle of either being in the light palette or the dark palette family. For example, if a tile was required to be selected for the back wall of the bar, because it's in the lighter palette, we'd keep our selection in the white family, and again, play with different textures and finishes as opposed to color. The third area that continues our inspiration and abstraction of the falls happens inside the audience chamber, where the walls are covered with acoustic paneling. Again, we kept the vertical striping consistent with the patterning that we discussed on other areas of the project. But this time we alternated with strips of 5 different dark shades of fabric that covered the acoustic panels, ranging from medium gray to black and shades in between. Despite being a theater that seats 5,000 people, we wanted to create a cozy and intimate atmosphere. The seats, walls, and ceiling were kept in a darker palette as well. By keeping the interior palette relatively simple, light or dark, we were able to play up this contrast and the drama of transitioning from a light-filled and airy space to one that is dark, atmospheric, and intimate, heightening the experience of watching and listening to the artistry of your favorite performer. Atu's coming up next will now tell you a little bit more about the interior of the audience chamber. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Atu Mzegi with Theatre Consultants Collaborative, TCC. And we'll start with image number 1. Niagara Falls is actually the 3rd OLG venue. The previous 2 are Casino Rama in Aurelia and the Windsor Casino, the image that you see. All 3 are 5,000 seats. Rama and Windsor are essentially twins. They are enormous flexible boxes, measuring 65 meters by 62 wide. The mix, you can see 1,650 on the flat, 2,500 on the telescopic 30 rows, 850 at the very rear are fixed. The back row is 65 meters, 215 feet from the stage edge. Remember that number. What's obvious in this picture, aside from the box, are straight rows, virtually no intimacy, it's just a box. The priority at the time was to be able to create a flat floor for other events. And I think what essentially happened over time was they realized events like the home shows and exhibits were competing with the same dates as your concerts and rock venues. Next. These are the seating diagrams for our venue. Clearly, it's a departure in concept, 5,000 seats again, minimal flexibility. It's a multi-level venue, curved rows, and intimate, certainly relative to anything else of this scale. It's 42 meters deep, compare that with 65, and 77 wide. Proportionally, the room shaping remarkably is similar to a Broadway theater, so it's a totally different field. Operationally, the circulation is extremely efficient. That's important for getting people in and out quickly. And also there's a lot of attention to how the seats are organized for being able to delineate ticket pricing, which the other venues really do not do. Very important and critical for any assembly space is to resolve barrier-free requirements, wheelchairs and access. And it has to be done right from the outset. It can't happen later. In assembly, you're required to have 3%. So that's essentially 150 wheelchairs. And we're happy to say that we're able to distribute that on every single level. By the way, for those of you that work in the US, ADA in a room this size would be 90. So our requirements in Ontario are quite demanding. Next. Here you can see the room during construction, at the tail end of construction, and the room shaping is obvious. The curved balconies optimize intimacy and that sense of envelopment, which is very, very important for the performers. But also you can see when you're sitting at one side of the room, you see audience at the other. So it has this kind of feeling of a gathering. Acoustically, all the events are amplified. So we have virtually every surface is absorption. Very tall volume. Now, interesting, at about 80% construction, the acoustician did some testing and found that that little tiny strip of the balcony front was bouncing sound back directly to the performers, and we were able to rectify that very quickly by adding another strip of absorption. Very tall volume. Here you see the flat floor in the middle is the only flexible space. On the right, you could see one of the requirements was to have a thrust stage. You might have a show like Seinfeld here. 5,000 is perfect for that kind of act. And the flat floor would be filled with portable seating. There's a back one moment. You also see that either side of the stage, there are enormous LED screens that are visible from every seat in the venue. And a very important point on the left side, the cross aisle, that's almost entirely wheelchair seating. And there will also be portable seating for companions. And that's perhaps the best location for wheelchairs. Next slide. This section I find really interesting. It shows that it's super compact. So the wall to the left, the black line, is essentially the property. So we're backing up, there's nowhere else to go. To your right, you're at the street. So for circulation, we had to create that bump out. And the theater basically takes up the entire volume, front to back. And you're wondering what the red line is? Well, if you're my generation, that's the O'Keefe Center, which then became the Hummingbird, and then the Sony, and as of last year, it's Meridian Hall. So it's a very interesting comparative because you can see that both venues are about 45 meters, 150 feet to the back row. The big difference is Niagara is 5,000 seats, and the O'Keefe Meridian Hall is 3,150. So that's a remarkable comparative. And if you look at the O'Keefe balcony, you can see it's a giant wedge, and we're able to put in essentially 2 levels of seats. At the very bottom, you see a little blue zone. That is the audio cockpit, which has a gala lift that goes up and down. At the top right, you see a very large catwalk, which is enclosed. Those are for follow spots. You can put in 5, 6 units up there. The small blue box in the middle is a very long lighting bridge that extends the entire width of the room. The top 2 zones are very important. They're technical zones with grid irons. And the next slide will show exactly what those do. So number 1, well, let me say first that theaters, what you don't see is theaters and performance facilities are essentially machines. There's an enormous amount of infrastructure that to accommodate all the basically the audio, performance, lighting, rigging, draperies, things that move up and down, whatever you need to accommodate whatever show you could imagine. So number 1 is the 4-stage grid, which is above the audience. And those are just sheets of plywood for the workmen that had ladders up there. We're at the tail end of the construction, and you can see the grid is literally a grid. You can pass cable conduit right through at any location. Number 2 is the lighting bridge. They haven't brought in equipment yet. The venue's sitting empty, but there would be an enormous array of lights along there, literally hundreds. Number 3 is the grid above the stage. It's 80 feet above the stage. And number 4 is the volume of the stage. The blue lights are catwalks where staff will go along. You can see the aluminum trusses and all the vertical cables. Those move up and down the trusses, accommodate lights. These are construction images. Obviously, I want to put in a nice plug for Grant Milligan, our structural engineer, for Quinn Dressel. This is a project at P3 with a very tight schedule, very tight budget, and we needed some really innovative solutions. So number 1 shows the steel going up. It's a steel structure, and the orchestra level is used for staging. Keep in mind, we're not at street level. This is, I believe Christoph said, 17 meters, thereabouts above. Number 2 shows the first balcony, and this was at the structural creativity. Grant had designed tiers made of 10 millimeter steel, constructed offsite, delivered in panels, and all put together. And just a thin concrete, 35 millimeter layer of concrete. That presented other problems. Most seating manufacturers require 50 millimeters of concrete for their seat bolts. So every hole or every bolt had to pre-drilled self-tapping bolts. It's 10,000 bolts just for the seats. But it went up very, very quickly. Number 3, you could see them working, and that's the view of the stage. And you could see the back wall, literally the property line, the hotel immediately behind it. To the right gives you a sense of scale during construction, and that wall you see with the openings, that's the street wall with just narrow bands of circulation. Next. This is the final slide, and you can see that the sight lines are absolutely fabulous. This is from the upper balcony, and what's unique is that you can see the forestage. When you compare it to the O'Keefe or Hummingbird, their sight lines are for the front to stage. So every seat in the house has optimum sight lines. You can see the screens either side. And when you come to this venue, the front of the balconies are terrific seats. What you don't see here is the flat floor area. Those have custom portable seats that match the fixed seats. That's it. On to our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lee Strickland. I was the senior project director of this project. From my standpoint, we were faced with, I think, 2 major challenges, which I would like to sort of review with you. One is, of course, as Guela and Atus mentioned, this is a P3 project. The unique thing about this, the client was not IO. The client was OLG. So this is the first time that OLG has built a facility under the P3 model, and it was had all the trimmings of a regular IO P3 project, including a PSOS, Schedule 3, Schedule 16, and the program data sheets, which we had to follow. OLG had a great project design team. They really had a lot of knowledge. They're very professional, very great to work with. And that was one of the rewarding things about this project, was working with a client like that. However, the projects, the PSOS on this project was not as tight as what you would normally find in an IO project for a hospital. Those are voluminous and they are very strict as far as what's required. The one for the Niagara Falls was a little bit loose, except for talking about the stage equipment and things like that, lighting, etc. But otherwise, it left a lot to be imagined. And probably one of the reasons for that is the fact that Again, unlike IO projects, this RFP that was put out had no site. There is no particular site that we had to design upon. We had to find the site. In our case, as Guela mentioned, it was on the top of the parking garage behind the Hilton Hotel. And it was very tight. You can see it there along Stanley and Murray Streets. And that made things really challenging. Now, from a standpoint of the getting back to the PSOS, one of the biggest challenges was because the spec was so loose, is it did give us a lot of latitude for design, but it also gave the contractor a lot of latitude regarding material selection. So we had to really arrive at a solution that met both the design intent of the PSOS and the budget of the design builder. And that at times was difficult, but we did get through it. There were a lot of contentious discussions on that, whether or not it would comply or not. Usually if the design builder recommended a product that we thought was an improvement, we strongly supported it. The client accepted it and we moved forward, but there were other ones that we did not feel met design intent and were actually incorporated into the project, but we did not change our drawings to reflect that. And that's primarily a liability standpoint. There were a lot of material selections made after financial close and, after the RFP. And it was during the process of arriving to financial close through all the design submissions. And even after financial close, there were submissions for all of the materials. And we were all the time evaluating whether or not it did meet the design intent and would be acceptable in the project. And that was seen to be an ongoing situation. So anyway, the other thing that we talked about, and you saw from that first slide, was that how everything is so intertwined with each other. We were going back and forth on whether to consider the theater as a new building, or a separate building, or whether it be integrated as one building with the hotel. And after a lot of analysis from the standpoint of the fire alarms, sprinkler system, security systems, and all that, we decided to make them separate buildings. And by making them separate buildings, we had to separate them with a firewall. And I'm sure everybody's gone through that. In our case, we had a firewall which was not what would normally be considered as something vertical. Ours went vertical and it went horizontal in all different shapes and forms. And that took a lot of convincing. You can see here on this, this is the ground level, and the red indicates the location of the firewall. There's a shaded area there in the center. That is, I'm sure you're all familiar with what's known as a measure-end vestibule, and that is where you actually walk between the theater and the hotel. And because of that, you can see here that are the vertical elements of the fire separation. Go to the next slide. And here it shows vertical as well as horizontal. For example, the entire stage floor was a firewall. And the difficulty we had was convincing the building department that a firewall is not necessarily vertical. It can go horizontal or vertically. And we went through all that with their building code consultant, with the building department, and we got approval by submission of an alternative solution. Here you can see more of where the separations were, but it was just all over the place because it was such a tight site, and we were just fitting to every nook and cranny that was available for us to take advantage of. Even the columns here you can see in blue, those columns support the theater. However, they get down through the hotel. So those are 4-hour rated structures at that point. So Guela, back to you.
So we're going to move to a little video since you can't walk around the site with us and see this project together with us. We're the closest best thing is the video that we used for design purposes, and it helped us in the design process. So just going to take a minute and walk through the building with us virtually. There we go. A big thanks to Christoph Schoen and Atus and Lee and the hundreds and hundreds of other people that participated in this design process. Structural engineers were Quinn Dressel, as Atus gave a shout out to Grant Milligan, who was amazing. Plan group was involved with us as the electrical and mechanical contractor, and MCW were the mechanical electrical design consultants. LRI was our code consultant, and were really imaginative and fantastic to work with. The team methodology were our colleagues trying to understand, what would work here and make the piece sauce within the framework of what the contractor had carried for construction, which was bird construction. And altogether, I checked, how much time our team alone at Art Petrov put into this project. And it was 30,000 hours. Shocking to think about in just a short period of time, in just about 14 months. So needless to say, lots of sleepless nights and lots of rolling up of our sleeves and brainstorming to try to get this thing resolved. We're all super proud of it. So we figure it's pretty cool there one day, okay? Whenever we all gather and things. Thanks very much for taking in our project. We're happy to take your questions afterwards. Hi, everyone. So here's the team. We're here to answer any questions you might have. Just to remind you, beside me is Christoph Gauthier, then Zach Sadowski, who worked on the proposal with us and the transition into the team, Sean Van Wyn, Atus Zaghi, and Lee Strickland, and looking forward to answering any questions. The question that came through just while we were doing our presentation is, what is IO and its Infrastructure Ontario? Our apologies for using that acronym. Most of these P3 projects are done through Infrastructure Ontario, but as Lee said, this project was done directly with the OLG as the client, being a provincial body. So I'm just trying to figure out how this all works. So happy to answer any questions. We will say that the project has been a very valuable experience for all of us, working so hard in such an integrated team. And we will, go on to our other projects with this experience behind us and having learned so much from doing this. So let's see here. I'm not sure if the system isn't working or our presentation was so thorough that there aren't any questions, but I'll just hand it over to anybody on the team to elaborate on anything that they think they missed or they would like to say. And anybody want to pipe up with any comments? So in that case, I will go on to say that for us, you know, working in Niagara Falls was a transformative experience because of that kind of big idea of trying to change the narrative of a city with a piece of architecture in one building. Personally, I've worked on projects or tried to work on projects in that region for a very long time. And in doing studies about how people experience Niagara Falls, the catchment area is enormous. People drive for 6 hours, 7 hours to get to Niagara Falls and typically spend less than an hour in the city of Niagara Falls. It's the destination, but the stop on the way to somewhere else. It could be Niagara-on-the-Lake, but it could likely be Toronto or even Northern Ontario. So part of the narrative from the city itself is to make Niagara Falls a more complete community, i.e., you know, allow people to have it considered to be not just a tourist attraction, but a place to live and work, and have visitors experience the breadth of Niagara Falls, which of course is the most magnificent natural feature, but also has cultural amenities. There's a vibrant theater program, there's art programs there, and obviously many of us know that the wine industry and fruit and veggies are centered there. And some of our colleagues will be doing a tour of a winery, I believe, towards the end of the conference. So that's all extending kind of the narrative of Niagara Falls. There's some questions that have come through. I'll just read out the first one. It's how challenging was the project to manage during COVID? So the project was substantial completion, believe it or not, was reached just before COVID. There has been ongoing work on the project since then. We have been unable to visit the site because of all the lockdowns in Ontario, but we know that Bird Construction has been on the site for the past year, working on some deficiencies, I believe. And so the actual working of the project was all of us in the studio together, many nights face to face, which of course made it easier. The biggest challenge working on a P3 project, I think each one of us could give a quick answer on that. For me, it was that traditional relationship with a client is very complicated in a P3 because you know, we were working for the contractor in a very collaborative team environment with Bird and OLG, but nevertheless, the reporting structure is very formal, and that for sure was the biggest challenge to me is that relationship with the client and the ultimate users, obviously. Does anybody else want to comment on that question, the biggest challenge of a P3?
I would agree, Guela, that it's not having a lot of face-to-face with some of the potential users and relying heavily on the PSOS, but all in all, it worked out well.
Another question is, what was the biggest thing that we would approach differently if we were to get another theater project similar to this? It's a great question. Lessons learned. What would we do differently? Well, for me, it would be get a bigger site where we didn't have to raise the theater in the sky and create this piano nobile and have much more room to organize everything at grade. I don't know. Atthews, what would you do differently if we had another?
I think you hit it right on. I think you mentioned during the presentation that theaters typically try and be all on one level. Loading is critical to be at stage level. So when you rely on vertical lifts, it tends to slow things down operationally, increases costs that way. Also for patrons, when you have older patrons, verticality makes it more difficult. So a larger site would have been really terrific.
Yeah, some of the amenities that are typically associated with the theater experience, like, you know, getting drinks or, you know, a little shop, we couldn't accommodate any of those things on the site, so it was so tight. But I guess in a way that's a good thing because it would push people out into the fabric of Niagara Falls to grab a drink and food and all of that. It's not like the theater, you know, sucked all the life into it. It just is one of a series of experiences that we imagine people would have in Niagara Falls. So I'm getting a heads up that I should wrap it up, and that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you around town when we're all out in public again. So take care, everybody. Bye.